that can drive from A to B. And this is also true for other systems. Food systems also have outcomes. There's lots of interacting parts that have outcomes. And those outcomes or emergent properties, they can be desirable. And then we speak of synergy. And it can also be undesirable. And then we speak of dysergy. So pollution, climate change are maybe undesirable outcomes of our systems. A food system is more than a value chain. This picture is the Dutch value chain. We see about 60,000 farmers on one end and then 70 million consumers and food manufacturers, suppliers, purchasing companies, retailers. So this is the value chain. But of course, systems are more than that. We see that the interactions in that value chain are influenced by all sorts of, what we call the rules of the game, or in the paper it's called the regime. The rules of the game around this value chain, maybe the financial rules, the rules imposed by investors, banks, shareholders, but also policies, regulations, infrastructures, knowledge systems. These are kinds of the players in this value chain orient themselves towards these kinds of rules of the game, and that produces certain outcomes. It produces a certain logic. And but this is even a broader representation of the food system that was made by some Wageningen colleagues. Here you also see in the middle all sorts of the value chain activities, and you see economic drivers and environmental drivers. And on the right-hand side, we see the outcomes of the food systems in terms of, characteristics, emergent properties of the system. Well, as I said, some of those outcomes are undesirable outcomes. Our current systems increasingly produce and reproduce undesirable outcomes. I mean, they provide food, yes, but they also provide pollution, they reproduce poverty, they cause climate change, polarization, obesity, disease outbreaks, etc. So we're not very happy with the kind of the emergent properties of the current food system. And the Netherlands is a good case in point here. So the Netherlands is a very small country in Europe, tiny little country, but it's the second largest exporter of agricultural produce in the world. We pride ourselves, or many people pride ourselves, and we have an enormous amount of flowers and dairy and meat and vegetables that we export. But as I mentioned, it's not all great. We are so in terms of scaling, and this sort of translates into the presentation that Nina will also give below. We have been scaling up a lot of modern technology. Wageningen University has been one of the prime drivers of new modern technologies. What has also scaled up is an enormous use of feed compounds imported from Brazil and Thailand. We have, scaled, if you want, an entrepreneurship culture where farmers look at themselves as entrepreneurs who are in the business of profit making. We have scaled up a lot of emissions, and farm size has scaled up. We see here two maps on the right-hand side, where you see actually that the plots have scaled up quite considerably over time. But there's also things scaling down, if you want, or maybe values that are being excluded. Biodiversity has gone down, water quality has gone down, and the number of farmers has also gone down tremendously. We had about 350,000 farmers in 1950, and now we have only, maybe 50,000 farmers left. Here, and those farmers, they produce a lot of emissions. We have a big crisis in the Netherlands at the moment, which is all about nitrogen, and farmers, they produce an awful lot of the nitrogen that is being deposited here. You see that on the map in the Netherlands, and which has dramatic consequences for biodiversity, for examples. Of course, it's important to mention in this context that farmers differ a lot. You see here on the left-hand side the typology of farmers that we made in 1990 of dairy farmers. So multiple goalers who had a strategy of self-sufficiency and low external input, thrifty farmers, who kind of try to balance their monetary input inflows and output flows. We had the cowmen, for example, who were dairy farmers who really went for maximum milk yield per cow, who were really nurturing their individual cows. We have the fanatical farmers, trying to gain a competitive advantage. And you see here the same farmers in terms of, they differ in terms of scale and also into the intensity of farming. Now, this was the 1990s. Now in the Netherlands, 2023, we talk about mega farms, which probably those fanatical farmers, and we have conventional farms, we have organic farms, but a lot of the farmers, have disappeared, right? I think it's mostly probably those multiple goalers and the thrifty farmers who have sort of, been phased out over time, and we're now left with the people more or less in this corner. So there are differences in terms of the benefits and the risks, and also the survival of who has been able to survive in this food system. And there's a lot of protest, because the government is taking stern measures now to reduce nitrogen, because everything is coming to a standstill in the Netherlands. Nobody can build a house because first you need to buy out a farmer. It's a complex story. So there's a lot of farmer protest in the Netherlands. So what we see, if you analyze this problem, we see that these problems and these dysergies, they emerge essentially from market failures, right? So there's a market logic in the value chain, in the system, where farmers, some farmers, banks, suppliers, food companies, supermarkets, they make a lot of profits, but they cause damage to nature, the environment, health, also to international development, because we're dumping all sorts of cheap stuff into West Africa, for example. And this damage is not incorporated in the current prices, in the current market arrangement, but they're shifted to the public sector, who has to clean up the mess. And then the public sector then shifts it back to farmers, and that's why the farmers are protesting. So if you wanted to change this system, if you wanted new rules of the game in the system, you would have to think of maybe, rules like, changing, that guarantee that entrepreneurs and shareholders and investors become responsible, right? So we need rules of the game that prevent that shareholders sell their stock, that they don't take any responsibility for the system, but just sell their stock 20 times per second if they can make a little profit out of that. We need maybe representation of public interests in food companies. We might need true pricing or minimum prices for sustainable produce, or compulsory quota for supermarkets to buy sustainable produce and sell it, or base their produce on sustainable feedstock, import restrictions, maybe new commons where we actually encourage farmers to cooperate and collaborate in new ways rather than compete with each other. And so these are maybe alternative rules of the game that would result in a completely different food system. But these are not in place. That is, it's a different thing. So this is an interesting figure. There is a lot of pressure on the system because we have a real crisis, the nitrogen crisis. So the current system is being destabilized, and we're currently in a little bit of chaos, if you want. But the system is not yet broken. It's not breaking down. The dominant institutions are still in place, and it's hard to phase out the system. We do see a lot of alternatives, organic farming, regenerative farming, crop mixes, nature inclusive farming, but they are not yet dominant and institutionalized. And so we're in this middle mess a little bit. And most of the initiatives we currently see are at the farm level, and they're not really changing the logic of the system. So that's not very surprising, of course, because achieving system change is really difficult, right? Systems are complex. They have multiple levels and spheres. The people in the system have different goals and purposes and different perspectives. They look at the system differently. They only see a part of the system, and they do not necessarily see what is happening at the other end of the system, maybe in terms of biodiversity loss, for example. There's different goals, objectives. The system is resilient. There are powerful players who keep the system in place, and nobody is in control. Not even the government is in control, right? And private. So we cannot simply engineer a new system. Although this is something that, if you look at what scientists do, they do as if they can engineer the system. They make beautiful food systems analysis using this graph, and they kind of play with it, and they give us the impression that we can engineer it, but it's not that simple. So there are also systems thinking is a very broad. There's a very diverse world. We can think. Some people think of systems as if they were machines. I was talking about these scientists who, think that they can optimize and engineer the system. Others look at systems as, as psychic prisons, more or less, that that can only be changed if you create a shock, or as arenas of struggle. Now, I'm not going into detail into this slide, but I think what we need is a kind of complex systems thinking, which looks at system change as something that happens through learning processes, through negotiation and conflict management processes, and negotiation-based building of coalitions. Because in the end, change is, you need a strong coalition if you want to make change, if you want to make system change. And this figure is also in the paper. It's a figure created by historians, Frank Geels and others, who have looked at how transitions or transformations have happened in the past. This is the old adoption curve. You've probably seen that. You see something like that sort of vaguely emerging in this figure as well. So it's a figure that is from innovation studies. And they talk about system change in terms of, that system change emerges from interaction between three levels. You have the existing system and what they call the regime, or the existing rule. What I said is the existing rules of the game, the existing policies, the dominant technologies, the dominant scientific understanding, the dominant cultures. And over time, maybe that regime can change. You see here a different configuration of the regime, towards time, but it's not. That takes a lot of effort. And in order to change, you need innovations or niche innovations, initiatives that try to challenge the system, create alternatives for the existing system, technical alternatives or institutional alternatives. Most of those innovations, they will fail because the system is too strong to compete with. But sometimes we see that these niches, they can break through. And an important factor which determines whether a niche can become successful or not is what is called the landscape level. So the landscape level is basically about trends that are there. For example, the nitrogen crisis is something that is currently happening. The war in Ukraine is happening. So there's lots of things that are happening at sort of above our heads, which put pressure on the system. Right? The nitrogen crisis really puts pressure on our agricultural system, and that makes that maybe things like nature inclusive agriculture or other forms of agriculture can actually manage to rearrange the system. But it's all about competition, and co-evolution. It is a little bit of a Darwinistic model of innovation. And if you follow from this perspective, we can think about what kinds of policies can we put in place to make change happen. Now, the first policy is that it is important to analyze what is happening at this landscape level. So to analyze what are the current trends and to try to develop visions about the desirable future. So, and there's methods and techniques to actually do that, to make people think about, what was the past, where do we come from, if these trends continue, where do we end up, and then where do we, is there something in the longer term that we can agree about? What is our vision? And then you can, if you have a vision, you can reason back, what do we need to do today to bring that system a little bit closer? And of course, you need to navigate that all the time. But so taking a long-term view is a very important element of working towards transition. Putting pressure on the system. Sometimes the pressure comes naturally, but sometimes you need to create pressures. For example, by advocacy campaigns. We see Extinction Rebellion has a lot of activity in the Netherlands. You can support pressure groups. You can create, the government can impose deadlines to the parties in the system and say, look, if you haven't agreed in 3 months' time, we will impose these kinds of measures because otherwise our system is going to pieces. So, but in one way or another, you need to put pressure on a system, because it's only when there is pressure that systems become sort of flexible. Creating variation and supporting variation is a critical element. These niches, in order, you need to have options, technological options. So you need to experiment with new technologies, new technological opportunities, but also with new rules of the game. So new market incentives, new taxation or business models or pricing systems. We need to think about those and experiment with those, not in splendid isolation, but we need, that's why the emphasis on joint. You need, if you want these experiments to have any effect in society, these need to be embedded somehow in a collaborative space. And well, so the scientist doing that kind of research is not an outsider sort of, watching at the system, but, actually working with the system and in the system to try to experiment and do useful things to create variation, because you need 10 options for one maybe to survive. It's also capturing existing diversity. So society is not waiting for scientists and researchers to come and bring options. Society is also itself already generating options. And you see here at the bottom is a farm in Ecuador in a very dry area. And this farmer, unlike all the other farmers in the area, had a very green farm. And so you can start thinking, hey, what is it that this farmer is doing? Why is it possible for him or her to thrive in an area which is very problematic for others? So this is a positive deviant, somebody who's deviating from the average. So actually studying these kinds of the existing diversity and looking at what we can learn from that is also very helpful. Also creates variation in the system. But these initiatives somehow need to be protected, as transition scholars say it, because you have an initiative, maybe an alternative technology or an alternative institutional rule, but of course that technology or institutional setup is not yet effective. It's in its beginning stages. It's not mature. It needs to learn from its mistakes in order to become viable. So there's a learning cycle needed to actually learn and to become more effective at competing with the existing system. And here you see, well, the design of an animal-free or chicken animal-free, no, not animal-free, it's an animal welfare, a positive chicken house. And here you see the experiment that is actually being taking place. But you need to then fund these kinds of experiments or make it possible for these to take place. Another thing is that we need to think about leverage points in the system. So I return then to this value chain image in the Netherlands. So where is the power in the system? Where can we leverage? Where do we need to focus our interventions to make sure that that others change as well? And what we currently see is that the government is trying to push farmers, right? The government is trying to make farmers change, but the power in the system is obviously somewhere else. It's in supermarket chains or purchasing companies. There's only 5 of them. If they change their policies, then everybody else in the system. And so you need to think where is the power in the system, and where can we put pressure best. And in the end, it is about building coalitions, right? It's about enrolling parties in a coalition who feel interdependent, who want to move towards a common future. That also means excluding people maybe are not interested in that future. So inclusion and exclusion are maybe 2 sides of a coin. Need to be able to manage conflict, develop narratives and share those narratives. And so that I often say that, change is prepared in the everyday conversations that are going on in society. If society starts to talk and think differently about things, then change is in the making. Then policymakers will also respond. And so we have to really think strategically about how our narratives should be multiplied in society. So just 2 slides by means of conclusion. I think transformative change in complex systems, it's not something that can be planned or predicted in detail. And the paper that we wrote is kind of a little bit of a critique, partly towards all these people who are doing food systems analysis. And we're basically saying, you need to talk about food system synthesis, which is a messy, competitive process. It's about communicating directions, it's about fostering learning, it's about navigating conflicts and building these coalitions towards a future. And that is not the same as rational planning or engineering. So that's something important to keep in mind. And of course, government policy has a key role to play in all this. Policy itself must transform. If you want a different system, then we need also different policies. Policies can provide directions. It can reduce uncertainty for stakeholders. Policy can work with institutional experiments. Policy can be used as a leverage or as a pressure on the system. And it's also clear that we cannot rely only on the private sector if it comes to defending public interests. And this is a report we did for the CG, to think about responsible engagement with the private sector. So this is what I wanted to share with you. I have a question maybe for the discussion later on, because I've now talked a little bit about the Dutch agricultural sector, but we're also thinking about international development. So maybe we can think and discuss what are kind of dis-synergies or what kind of failures do we see in the international development sector, or what rules in the game do we need to change? What innovations are needed, and who should act, who can put pressure on the system? But this is something maybe for the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kees. That was wonderful. Very nice overview of systems transformation and how messy they are. I put some questions in the chat actually, but we'll wait to hear Nina's presentation as well before we open up to Q&A. So thank you again, really appreciate it.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So thanks for this opportunity to share also some of the findings. My story is actually a little bit of a follow-up of the more conceptual part of Kees's story. And it's mostly empirical, and it's actually based on the work that I did for my PhD and during my work for Wageningen University. And I will zoom in more on the mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion and scaling in a particular element of food systems, namely agricultural research and extension systems. My story takes place in Ethiopia, a country largely dependent on rain-fed and smallholder agriculture. Between 2010 and 2020, I spent a lot of time in this beautiful country working as an action researcher for Wageningen University, mostly on agricultural transformation. And I've indeed experienced how difficult it is to actually contribute even to transformation of a system. So the outline of my presentation, one of the key messages of my entire story actually is the importance of the understanding of the context in which you operate as a researcher, development worker, or advisor. So that's why I will first spend some time introducing the context of Ethiopian smallholder agriculture to you. And then the core of my presentation is, of course, some of the findings, taking you through the findings of my PhD research. And then lastly, I will go through some of the implications of my findings. So Ethiopian history. Ethiopia has a very long history, going back to what is generally accepted the cradle of one of the first humans, Lucy. You can see her on the picture here. Time does not allow me to go into detail about the early history of Ethiopia, how interesting it may be. The focus of my research actually in this presentation will start around the period of 1800, where the ox plow farming system with the Maresha plow, as you can see on the pictures below, starts to spread. Before this time, the majority of what is now called Ethiopia consisted of pastoralist cultures in small kingdoms, which didn't have much contact with each other. And the ox plow system was introduced by the Tigrayan and Amharan people, the empire, which actually started to dominate the entire area of what is now called Ethiopia. And this early imperial drift was accompanied by major shifts in other dimensions of social life too. So first of all, the introduction of Orthodox Christianity, but also forms of taxation and an overarching political state influencing social life. For instance, one of the things that really changed is the introduction of this Maresha plow. It required households to maintain a stable pair of oxen throughout the year. And this really changed seasonal labor mechanisms and also gender divisions of labor, which were now aligned to the annual cropping cycle. The state enacted influence through control over heritage and mobilization and reallocation of local elites. This is the first time that local elites really appeared. And these practices are actually quite still dominant in contemporary Ethiopian culture. So around 1930, or in 1930, Haile Selassie became the emperor of Ethiopia, and he's known for successfully fighting the Italians, but also for his modernization agenda. So during his rule, the basic institutional infrastructure for agricultural research and extension was established. For example, the first agricultural school, the Ministry of Agriculture, the first agricultural research stations, and also the division of mandates between the Ministry of Agriculture, which was mandated to do the extension, the universities, and the research stations. So in 1974, the socialist Dirk regime came to power, and they introduced the Land Act, and which meant actually that all land was nationalized, so became actually in possession of the government. And the Dirk regime also established state farms and agricultural producer cooperatives. And they did that also by conducting a massive mobilization campaign, accompanied by the establishment of an effective state apparatus, including peasant associations. And those small associations at the village level linked the farmers and rural households to the central governments in Addis Ababa. And that had never existed before. And that is actually still existing, that type of structure still existing in Ethiopia. So this meant for farmers that they lost their social networks again. and were coerced to form new ones in these peasant associations and these cooperatives linked to the military regime. This really left a bitter taste of this coerced collaboration in many of Ethiopian farmers. So allocation of land, regulation and support and taxation, they were all arranged through these peasant associations and these cooperatives. So it really has a massive impact on social life, actually. So after a few years of political unrest and civil war under the Derg regime, the Tigray Popular Liberation Front, TPLF, came to power in 1991. And they also established the One National Party, which was actually the umbrella party of all the different ethnic-based regional parties in Ethiopia. And the ruling party, so the EPRDF, they declared democratic developmentalism to be their informing ideological orientation. And according to the prime minister of that time, Meles Zenawi, this approach, democratic developmentalism, would make it possible to transform Ethiopia's political economy from one of pervasive rent-seeking to one that is constructive to value creation. And this rent-seeking narrative is really important even still now, actually, because it was used as a way to encourage farmers to become more modern. Smallholders in that time were considered as inherently backward, lazy, and rent-seeking, and in need to be taken along in a modernization project. So the ruling party at that time really heavily invested in smallholder agriculture through research and agricultural extension. This is really huge what happened in that period. And this was also the first time that the National Agricultural Extension Package approach was introduced. The farmers were really encouraged to shift to modern varieties, chemical fertilizer, and new agronomic practices such as row planting. So this has seen a really actually a massive economic growth in that period and increases in agricultural productivity. However, food security and poverty persisted among large proportions of the population. And also in the high potential areas, so in the Ethiopian highlands where there's lots of rain. And this is also the period where the model farmers approach was introduced. And I will come back to the model farmers in more detail in my story. As you might know, have heard on the news in the past years in Ethiopia are characterized by political unrest again, and even civil war. So yeah, my research actually is focused until the period of 2019. So I don't have the newest developments taken along, and also not in this presentation. So in short, you can see here what the Ethiopian history, at least the one that is relevant for my story, has been the key elements. So farmers really introduced several coping mechanisms to actually deal with all these life changes. So one of them is keeping the government, so the Mengistu, at a distance. They really prefer to not depend too much on the government because they never know what the government wants from them and if it's actually in their benefit. Another thing that's really apparent is that Ethiopians have come to accept this top-down power relation of having a ruler as a fact of life. And this is also part of the Orthodox tradition. So as a result, openly critiquing or resisting those in power is really rare or even non-existent in Ethiopia. So as long as those people are in power, farmers accept them and they find non-visible ways of resisting, if at all. So open critique is really not common. And the Derg regime has really left Ethiopians with a bitter taste of how cooperatives and other forms of coerced collaboration could devastate their lives. So they've learned they're not so eager to become a member of a cooperatives or to really link themselves too much with things related to the government's rule. So now my research actually. So I based my research on the one program, which is called Cascade, and it was active in 2011 until 2019. It was funded by the Dutch embassy. And the aim was actually to contribute to farmer income and food security, smallholder farmer income. And the approach was testing and promoting new technologies that increase agricultural productivity. And those technologies are, for example, modern varieties, and other farming practices, and also really fertilizer recommendations, appropriate fertilizer recommendations. The program was managed by Wageningen University Research, but it was implemented by 6 Ethiopian universities, and they worked in interdisciplinary teams together with the bureaus of agriculture and, of course, farmers. It was a participatory action research program. And you see the two dots there. There was where I did my field work. It was in the south of Ethiopia. And the crops that I focused on was malt barley, what you see on the above, which is cultivated to make beer. And also injera. This is teff is the crop which is grown a lot in Ethiopia, and it's used to make the famous pancake, which is delicious, by the way. So those were the 2 crops that I focused mostly on. So now I will come to my key findings. The first finding relates to the organization of on-farm trials and their role in scaling agricultural technologies. So on-farm trials are really trials that are on-farm, as the word says. They're not on a research location, but on a farmer's field. And this is really to find out how improved technologies perform under farmer conditions. In Quescape, we organize thousands of such trials. And the technologies that were being tested are, for instance, improved varieties of teff, malt barley, or pulses, in combination with fertilizer recommendations and farmer practices. So on-farm trials are believed to be powerful. Farmers can see with their own eyes how promising technologies outperform local or their own practices. And field days are an important moment for programs like Cascade, but also other agriculture programs, to also show to others, to the government and others and donors, to show their success to the world. So as on-farm trials are presented to donors and governments as experiments, in reality, researchers face a dilemma because they also really want to make them work. So this is really a dilemma that researchers are faced with. And as you can see here in this quote from one of the project staff of Cascade, is that he was really struggling with this experimental part of the trials because he just wants to make it work. He just wants to have a success, actually, because that's also good for him, good for his career, and good for the project. So this is really a dilemma. And so to increase the likelihood of success of those on-farm trials, researchers sometimes tend to introduce biases. So here, for example, what you see here is that in Cascade, in this program, the researchers tended to select so-called male model farmers, so men, and also model farmers for their trials. This was also encouraged by local governments who were involved in the selection of the trial hosts. And model farmers are, this is well known, they're significantly wealthier than non-model farmers. And the very reason for someone to be called a model farmer is because he or she outperforms other farmers. So he or she has to invest more labor, use improved seed and fertilizer. And they generally have larger and more fertile plots too. So here you can see that there is this bias in the trials that we used. Another bias was the way that technologies were being evaluated. Even though we had a multi-criteria analysis, which we called integrated validation protocol, in the end, you can see there's a strong bias towards yield data, actually. So most of the technologies that were being promoted for scaling, they were only tested for the yields. So they had higher yields than other varieties. But other elements like farmer preference analysis, so what farmers actually want, and also economic analysis, so what kind of costs are involved by using those new varieties and new practices, in most of the cases, they were not taken into account when new technologies were being promoted. And then a third bias, which is also sometimes happening, is that, or this is not really a bias actually, but what we see happening quite often is that in the trial setting or in the experimental setting, we see high yields, but then once the project has finalized and left, the yields of the introduced technologies, they decrease. And that's mostly because farmers then adapt or don't do exactly what was done in the trial. And one of the things that is changed often is, for example, farmers don't sow in rows, but they broadcast, so they just throw the seeds in the field, or for example, they weed less than is actually recommended. And that results in lower yields, as you can see in this figure. This is actually an example of Bangladesh, but This is happening quite a lot. So preliminary conclusion on this part of my finding is that this dual role of on-farm trials, so both for experimentation and for demonstrating successes, is actually problematic because of the fact that researchers search for the best farmers, the best soils, and really look for success. The trials have limited external validity. So the socioeconomic circumstances that we see out there in the real world are sometimes too different from what is being tested. So trials, in that sense, contribute to the success of trial results, but they may not be very helpful to understand whether the average smallholder farmer will or could actually use this technology once the project leaves. So another part of my work was actually about how programs like CASCAPE, but also other programs, may unintentionally actually contribute to a reproduction of social exclusion. So first, here you see a picture here of an Ethiopian farm. And the good news is that Ethiopia has been reproducing a small elite of very successful farmers. And one of them you see here on the right, the one who's calling, the big guy. Model farmers are considered, as I said before, they're considered innovators who need to be followed by the rest of the farmers to get out of poverty. And the notion of model farmers is part of the official policy in agricultural research and extension. And they have a theory of scaling around this. That is that successful farmers show how to do it well on their farm, and then others will follow by example. And if they follow, then everybody does the right thing. So this notion of model farmers is actually quite politicized in Ethiopia because model farmers are appointed by local authorities. You can see the two other guys in the middle of the picture. They are extension agents, so agricultural agents. And they really feel the pressure to demonstrate success stories to their superiors. The local authorities are in dire need of people who, with assets and a willingness to participate in their program. This is because local authorities are being judged by the number of people that they enroll in modern technologies in these programs. So in return of their participation, model farmers receive lots of agricultural support and other type of support. And the majority of smallholders who are doing the actual labor are actually largely excluded from agricultural support. So you see a group of people in the back, they're actually the daily laborers. So they are actually farming the land. And as I will share in my story later on, they are actually deprived of many of the support that this model farmer is actually getting. I found actually two very important reasons for non-adoption. So why farmers found it difficult or didn't want to adopt these new packages. The majority of farmers face severe difficulties accessing seed, fertilizer, and agricultural extension. Extension agents have limited time, of course, so they prioritize visits to model farmers. Some of the farmers I spoke to had even never had a visit of an extension agent. An interesting detail was the membership of the cooperative in the village that I did my fieldwork. This cooperative is the mechanism through which fertilizer and seed are formally distributed. And it's actually officially not allowed to buy seed and fertilizer on the market, because only through registered cooperatives. This is because of the quality. However, the majority of the farmers could not become a member of this cooperative because they could not afford the membership fee, which was set by the founding members, and it was really high. So even if the majority of farmers would really want to, it was very difficult for them to access these modern technologies and the support. To get in the picture of the government, a farmer needs to invest a lot of time socializing with government agents, visit political meetings, invite extension agents for coffee, and do all these things to invest and to get into the picture of a government agent. And poor farmers, as you see the daily laborers, they don't have normally time to do all these things because they have urgent concerns to get food on the table for their families. So this is also a threshold that they faced. And another important threshold for a significant proportion of the smallholders was their fear of investing all their resources in just one technology. This mostly applies to the poorer segments of the society. So farmers with very small plots of land, less than a hectare. And also those are often female-headed households or other poor farmers. They have diverse cropping systems to spread the risk of crop failure. So this group experiences a strong pressure from the government to invest in modern seed and fertilizer. And this push for modernization puts such farmers in a very difficult position because they need to take a loan often to access the fertilizer and the seed and the labor. And for this loan, they depend on the government, So if their harvest fails, they become indebted by the government, and that's really not what they want. So I've heard actually numerous stories of farmers who know people in the village that were imprisoned or their farm inputs were actually taken by the government because they could not pay back their loan. So such farmers, if it was their free choice, they would prefer to use technologies that help them spread the risk rather than investing in just one technology. So to make it even a bit worse, farmers who are not able or willing to participate in such agricultural modernization campaigns are constantly placed in a negative spotlight. They are being portrayed as lazy, not serious, or disloyal to the government and the fight against poverty. And this negatively affects their social status. As I mentioned in my introduction, Ethiopia has quite a strong directive government, and there's limited space to critique such practices. So that was also quite difficult for our program because we didn't know actually how to really alter this situation. So as I mentioned before, poor farmers do not have the time and assets to invest in good relationships. In return, they're being portrayed as disloyal or dissenter sometimes. This actually results in a downward circle of exclusion and further marginalization. So this is the reproduction of social exclusion, as I call it. On the other hand, we see that these model farmers have the time and assets to invest in their relationships. They, in return for their loyalty to the government, they receive support. And this, again, provides new opportunities for them. So this is an upward circle of their socioeconomic status. And as long as the underlying incentives and sanctions remain unchanged, none of those players is likely to break this circle. And external initiatives like the Cascade program that are blind for these underlying mechanisms are likely to actually contribute to the perpetuation of this process of social exclusion. So some of the implications of the findings that I want to share with you. So the first part of my findings made clear that an understanding of scalability requires an understanding of drivers of technology adoption at scale. And this really calls for methods that increase the knowledge and understanding on the farmer's assets base, on in and output markets, and on socio-political dynamics of access, but also the effects of trends on farmers' livelihoods options. And it became clear through my research that these on-farm trials are poorly suited to acquire these insights because they're not at the right level to inquire about elements of access and the larger socio-political arena surrounding technological change. So actually what we see is that the introduction of modern technologies, as we see in Ethiopia, as an example, to me, it shows clearly that technological change is inherently political in nature. And in my case, it was also clear that technology itself is not neutral per se. It actually had social effects and also negative effects in some cases. So the technology, the seed and the fertilizer were part of a larger social political system. And it is notably those without land or with very limited amounts of land, those with limited social networks, such as female-headed households, but also other poor farmers, they find it really difficult to benefit from these programs, and actually they're actually being further marginalized. So extra and appropriate efforts are needed to reach those groups. And it made me really think about the importance actually of empowering such marginalized groups to create an equal level playing field for collaboration between researchers, local authorities, and farmers. So the key messages of my story. Well, first of all, understanding the context in which you operate, it reveals that scaling is far from a technical exercise, like Kees already mentioned, but it's part of an inherently political landscape. Organizations who are blind for this risk to contribute to further marginalization of already poor groups. It makes it important, in my view, for donors, but also for agricultural programs to reflect on their own role in relation to local partners, acknowledging that they are part of a larger arena of power structures and their responsibility in addressing these. So that is the conclusions that I draw from this story. Thank you for listening. Here, some acknowledgements. By the way, Kees Leeuws was my promoter, so he made it also happen. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Yeah, really, I should say a wonderful example of how, situations, we can really make situations worse. And this study was meant to be participatory action in nature and ended up really potentially exacerbating issues within the community. And I think also helps to highlight these niche or technology ideas that we come up with in the model case presented in order to disrupt this larger system. We really have to think about what it is we're trying to disrupt, and if the technology we're choosing is truly disrupting it or actually contributing to our anti-goals, which is further marginalization. So thank you so much for highlighting that work. Gives us a very clear example of things we need to consider when innovating for social transformation specifically. So now I'm going to open it up for questions. I will start with a question from Jonathan in the chat. And Jonathan, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you like, or I can convey your question.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Erin. Yeah, great presentation, Nina, and great presentation, Kes. I mean, I was just curious, we do these studies and these are quite revealing, particularly on this model farmer approach, which is actually also being used in several other contexts and countries. I was just curious to know if you ever managed to get an opportunity to also give this feedback to also the extension office or system there that you worked with, and what would have been a reaction, because this is useful feedback also for them and some useful learning there.
Yes, thanks for your question. Well, first of all, I have to say that it's quite a politicized topic. So it was not easy to talk about these things, especially not in the beginning. But as I was gathering my data and as some things were becoming more and more clear, I could show some of the things. And I have to say some positive things is that if you show especially quantitative results, then the Ethiopian government was open to these kind of critiques or constructive remarks. And actually, I have to say that also the people we worked with in our program, they were able to negotiate with the government. That program got much more influence in selecting whom to work with in our trials. So in the beginning, it was mainly the government who selected the farmers, and they only selected model farmers. But in the newer phase of the program and in other programs that are happening now, we said, well, we want to also have an influence on that, and we want to have a more socioeconomically diverse group of people to test our technologies on.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question that I think relates to both of your presentations and something I think about a lot as I focus. The Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Horticulture works a lot on supporting local-led research and bringing up solutions from a grassroots perspective. And I liked your slide case where you talk about positive deviance and looking at local solutions in order to scale up. So these are solutions that have been generated essentially under the current system and work well. And observationally, if you look out into the current system and you see something that's working really well, you try to promote it. And I'm just wondering about the tension between bringing something up in a system that maybe you're actually trying to change from a different perspective. So for instance, the trials that you showed might be more agriculturally productive, but it's operating very successfully in a system that is maybe marginalizing women. And so how do you sort of think through what's working well within a system, but in a different system, you want to change, you want to change the relationship between women and men and create more empowered women. I don't know if that question makes sense, but I'd love to hear your perspectives on it.
Yeah, I can try to start. So, I mean, these positive deviants, they sometimes, some of these positive deviants, they work under the current system, but like in your example, if you're interested in looking at households where men and women have a different kinds of relationship, or where gender, as you could in principle look for households that, despite the dominant culture of maybe repression of women or whatever, that are doing well, right, in terms of gender relationships. So they are positive deviants because they are doing well. They have different characteristics, even though they are imposed or sort of exposed to the same kind of detrimental conditions. So I think that, yeah, we can learn from them how to restructure the system in a way, because but it depends on, I mean, we can also, in the Dutch context, we could, select positive deviants who are, what depends on what you regard positive, right? I mean, we have deviants that are maybe mega farms that are, increasingly intensive and highly productive and with high profit. And they maybe deviate from others, but we would not regard them as positive deviants because they still produce all these negative side effects. So yeah, you have to carefully select those things that you think are actually competing with the dominant system and draw the lessons from them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose as a simple answer, you have to essentially look for what your goal is and make sure to focus on that rather than, a different system that you don't need to be engaging with. That makes a lot of sense. Nina, did you want to comment on that as well?
Maybe briefly. Well, I would always think that you need both. So because if you only focus on the niche or on the positive deviance, I think it will be difficult in the end to really change the system. And if that's your goal, then I would definitely also think of other strategies or governance arrangements or other levels in which you operate.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you want to add to this or ask another question?
No, just another question maybe to Kes, actually, and more in relation to the systems transformation. So Kes, of course, I think from your presentation it's clear, systems transformation is quite multifaceted and probably takes long as well. However, the landscape in which we mostly find projects or initiatives that we work with is quite limited in terms of the time and the funding periods. So, I would imagine there are probably indicators for how, to tell, even if it's a limited initiative project, that you are already starting to contribute to systems transformation. You may not tell what would happen at the end, but what are some of the indicators along the way to, keep an eye on as you? Yeah.
This is a big challenge. So, I mean, system innovation trajectories easily take 10, 15, 20 years. And projects are typically 3 or 4 years, right? And then they start asking measures of success, right? And often, yeah, that is a big puzzle, I think, and it actually is part of the question that I posed. Are there any things in our international development sector which maybe are systemically wrong? And one of the things I would say, we're using the wrong indicators in terms of assessing progress. I mean, if you want to assess progress along the way of system transformation, you would be looking for indicators like whether or not joint visions have emerged, or whether or not coalitions are being strengthened, whether or not the way policymakers talk about the system and how they frame problems and solution, whether that has changed, or whether so it's not about whether people have adopted technology or about numbers of farmers reached by trainings or something. So which are typical. If you look into theories of change, that of projects, those are the kinds of things that often come out. So I think we need to be much more creative in indeed identifying indicators, for long-term change processes, and make them also credible to funders, because qualitative research is not always, but things like coalitions or whether people have shifted their problem frames and solution frames, they can be measured actually quantitatively. There's lots of forms of network analysis and discourse analysis that actually can be quantified. So I think we need to be much more strategic and creative in that space.
Excellent points. Maria, would you like to unmute yourself, or I can convey your question as well?
Yeah, I can talk. Hi, hello, Case. Hi, Nina. Thanks for the presentations. So I wanted to ask you, so many research and development organizations have colonial roots, right? Like the whole development machine. Now it's more common that we hear about decolonial perspectives. From your experience and your work, as researchers, how do you embrace those perspectives, or maybe if you find them useful or not? And then the second one, how the overall research and development community could be doing better in that realm. And the second one, especially for Case, if we aim for systems transformation, what are research questions to trigger that transition? As you were saying, it's a long-term process. And yeah, you just mentioned indicators, and that's an interesting point. If you have anything else to add, that will be great. Thank you.
I missed the second part of your question. Sorry.
Yeah, the second part, I think it's already a bit raised by Jonathan on what we can do on this transformation. And I'm not sure if there is a particular set of research questions for you that are still there, that we should know that we should pay attention more in these research questions that haven't been answered, and we need to think differently about them.
Like if we were writing a research article, what would be like the further research direction?
Yeah, no, I get
Yes.
it. Yes. Well, and then their first question on decolonize. I mean, yes. I mean, I work at a university with a colonial history, right? And I'm maybe not the best position to talk about decolonization. I mean, it's a debate that is running here at the university. And we're trying to go through our curricula and check. We're trying to develop indicators or perspectives on decolonization. But I operate. I think still the international development sector has many traces of our colonial history. I think, our power, the way international development is organized and how budgets are controlled and how goals are set, all of that has colonial legacies. And I must admit that I'm also part of that. I work at a university and we participate in these programs, even though they should be critiqued in many ways. And, it's not easy. We tried to work. I worked with the CGIAR, and we tried to sort of work in a way where the funds that we were using would be controlled from the bottom up, right? But it's very difficult. The CG doesn't work like that. So you run into all sorts of ingrained mechanisms that make it very difficult. And somebody needs to put pressure on that system. And that was actually my question for the discussion, maybe in the second hour or whatever, but we're probably already in there. So I would really want to learn about that, because I don't have the answers really, how to transform the international development sector, other than that somebody needs to put pressure on it. It's not going to change if you don't put pressure. And that pressure can come from different sides, including from people like me, but I think there are probably outsiders needed as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Nina probably has thought about these things, yes.
Well, I can only say that I also don't have the answers to it, and I'm also part of the system, so it's difficult. It has been this has been one of the most difficult struggles for me in this work, this legacy indeed. And one of the things that even made it more complicated for me in with the experience in Ethiopia is that we really wanted to put the Ethiopian universities and government in the driver's seat, but through my research, I discovered that there's all kind of mechanisms of exclusion going on also in Ethiopian culture. So it's also then a question of who is then, if you say it has to be local, bottom up, who is then the right person then to be in the driver's seat, and who should decide that? So I get these errors in my mind, to be honest. It's very difficult to answer these questions, and the risk is that if you can't answer, then you just continue with your work. So if you have any suggestions on this, please enlighten us, because it has been bothering me actually in the past few years, and it's difficult.
No, I think we need to have a collective consultation because there are no right or wrong answers right now. We are in that pathway of learning about this, and it also bothers me too. So because there is no straightforward answer yet, but I think it's good that we are having these type of discussions and asking those questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that what we're trying to do a bit with this webinar series and class is to bring up these questions. Decolonialization and theory has come up over and over again. So it's something hopefully we can, work toward in this small community of practice. But when we do talk about innovation systems, so often it starts with the challenge. And I think a lot of the decolonial things we need to do start before the challenge. So if you think of, an agriculture system linearly, which of course it's not, but who's deciding on what the challenges are, who is at the table, who are we moving the needle for? These all relate to decolonization, and who gets to be the expert. That's also, so yeah, big topic. Just want to let people know we're going to stay in this Zoom. We'll keep taking Q&As for the class. Those who are just joining for the webinar series are welcome to stay on or hop off, but we'll continue here in the Zoom link. Mirza, you have a question?
Yes, I joined late, so I'm not that qualified to ask big questions, but I found it super interesting, this discussion. I will look at the recording. I've done my PhD in Wageningen with the Africa Rising project, and I'm a postdoc in UMI on innovation scaling. So I'm learning a lot. This is all very new to me, but I just wanted to throw in two things. I've also, beside my PhD, completed training as a systemic coach and change manager. And from there, I got a lot of very practical communication tools and also an attitude how to interact with others that you want to help, right? I mean, the question is, how do we communicate and approach, and how are we aware of the role we play? And of course, our nightmare is, with all the efforts that we put in it, to make something worse, because maybe we don't understand how the system works. So my feeling is, but I don't have it all together yet, that we can learn from so many other insights and disciplines already in our very academic work. There are very practical ways of engaging and communicating that are careful, that put whoever is in front of us into the driver's seat of their own social transformation and actual change. And if we want to have an impact on farmers, smallholder farmers' lives, then it's us talking to them and really getting their perspective and being more not necessarily the experts, but also in the coaching sessions, I consider myself more like a midwife. It's not my child, it's yours, but I know this process. So we are accompanying others in a very smart and systematic way, and it's almost like enzymes and catalyzing a change happening with having boundaries in terms of our values and what we support and what we do and what we don't do. But it's not us. When we're experts always on somebody else's systems and lives, and that's just somehow not true. We are the experts on the processes and accompanying that very well. I think that is our task. And yes, research questions are, of course, the fundament of what we do, but there's also our function and our attitude that we can, I think, sharpen in all of this discourse. So I just wanted to bring that in. And also, I've now had a gap of working in academia. I've worked at a hospital and with an NGO. And I think we need to, looking at the social transformations happening so fast, not driven by academia, rather driven by businesses or crises and so on. So on one hand, we want to be more sensitive towards all of these other aspects that we have maybe neglected also in the past, and be more gender sensitive and decolonialize this discourse. But we need to also take care that it doesn't hold us back and that we stay pragmatic and that we can achieve something. Otherwise, I think maybe we will just play a minor part of being part of this positive change. And I think there's so much potential. We need to use that very well, I think. So maybe we can learn from, maybe the way that businesses operate, plus having this and teaming up better to advance. So this is just some thoughts. And I'm trying to learn more from you and follow this group of practice. Thank you so much.
Can I say so? I mean, I think your comment about, fostering real communication and dialogue and considering yourself, it's not yours. We are not the system, right? The midwife kind of analogy that you drew, and that we should be process experts perhaps rather than giving direction. I think and eliciting what it is that the systems that we're working with, where they want to move. I think that is really important. The process, the quality of processes matters tremendously. Also, if so that there's this macro level and system, and there are niches, but the quality of a niche and the success of a niche all depends on it being able to foster connections between people and to learn from each other and to build from there. So I think we need those skills very much, I think. So yeah, I appreciate that comment.
Yeah, may I add a small note on that? I also appreciate that comment a lot, and in general the story and that you told. I just want to share from my experience in some countries which have more directive government, like Ethiopia, but also in Rwanda, and there may be other examples that. Even though I like the narrative of being a midwife or being some kind of neutral facilitator, I think we should not be naive by how we are being perceived. If we come there with big cars from CGIAR or from the government, that really influences how people look at us, or I can speak for myself, it influences how people looked at me, because they thought I was coming from a rich country and I was sent by the government. And in Ethiopia, that gives quite a few messages for farmers about what they said. And it took a long time before I had the confidence of the farmers in the villages where I did my field work, before they started to open up and share different stories than what they said in the beginning. So I think this notion of how you're being perceived is really also very important.
Thank you. Jiang, do you want to come in and ask your question? I think it is an important clarifying question.
Yeah, I've seen the question. I can try to answer. So I mean, that food systems synthesis versus food system analysis. I mean, it's a little bit. I was asked to write this paper by a bunch of people who were really all about food systems. But if you look at what they were doing food systems analysis. Like dissecting, describing the system. Taking up parts and trying to understand, to create a better understanding of the relationships in the food system. They were really scientists, and as scientists, we're good at analysis, but analysis is also about dissecting the parts of the system, right? It's not, the systems don't change because we analyze them, right? And we cannot engineer a system. It is a political struggle to change a system. So this line in the paper, which is about, we should do more than food systems analysis, is we should try to build new systems, and the paper tries to, and that's the synthesis, the building. Putting new systems together is not the same as analyzing the old system, or and it requires, well, all these kinds of strategies, policy strategies that I was trying to describe. But it was a bit of a word game, because all these people were talking about food systems analysis, and I wanted to position myself against that and said, no, we need to talk about synthesis, not analysis. But the synthesis is really building, creating, fighting for new kinds of systems. I hope that clarifies a bit.
That actually also makes me wonder about, and I think both of you could comment on it, and I'd welcome any of our participants here as well to comment on it as we move to a more discussion-based platform. So and as Nina, you describe yourself as an action researcher, and I would definitely describe myself the same way. And I feel like I have some pretty strong hypotheses around what would make a more rigorous and effective innovation system. And that is around, decolonization and bringing in more voices and being really much more user-driven in our systems thinking. I'm just wondering about what our role, I think sometimes I border on an advocate, and my research sort of lines up with that in ways of like operationalizing some of the theory, like the tools, Gender Up, that Case and I worked on. But I'm just curious about your thoughts around these lines, these different roles. I mean, scientists are supposed to be quote unquote objective, and I'm not sure I can completely claim that at all.
Case, you want to go ahead?
Well, maybe we actually, it's
Yeah.
interesting because Nina and I have just been organizing a couple of workshops within our own university about the roles of scientists that scientists can play legitimately. But maybe you go ahead, Nina. I can put up a slide if you want.
Yeah. Well, personally, I think scientists strive to be impartial, but they are also influenced by their own values. And that influences what they do in terms of research, how they do their research, and then these kind of things. And I would also consider myself more on the, maybe not activist research, but I find it more important that the research that I do is valued by the ones that I'm doing my research with, than publishing an academic paper. That's also maybe why I'm not ending up in academia. And that's also how I would define action research. So constantly checking with the ones that you're doing the research with, whether it's farmers or local governments or NGOs or others, to try to check with them, how they appreciate your contribution to whatever it is that you want to change. So that would be a rather extreme point of view, I guess.
Case, are you preparing us a slide?
I'm preparing a slide.
Are there any others who want to comment on that, or you're certainly welcome to bring up another topic as well as Case.
So, well, but yeah, let me share the slide if I.
Sure.
So in this workshop that Nina and I have done, so we distinguish different roles of academics, and there's actually quite some literature about roles that academics may play, and we distinguish, the pure scientist, that is the person who just states, I build knowledge and others can use it at will, but there's also a role that you could say is sort of the science arbiter, which sort of responds to a value-laden request. So somebody says, what options do we have to address climate change? So there's a value, so it's no longer neutral. As soon as you respond to a request that has a value in it, then you're no longer a neutral. You're not longer playing a neutral role, right? Somebody is asking a question, a value-laden question, and then you can say, well, science is telling us, from everything that we know, if this is your value, then you can do this, that, or the other. Right? And so you're already, no longer just playing the neutral guy. Then you have the honest broker, who kinds of maps the whole field, the different values in society, and sort of maps it, depending if this value is your priority, then maybe these and these are your options, or and if that value, so the honest broker doesn't take a position, but he provides all the options for all the values that are at stake. And then you have scientists who play issue advocate roles that are really, that have a value commitment themselves. And, the climate scientists who really ringing the bell and saying, that our climate, we must respond to the climate crisis or the nitrogen crisis or whatever. And all those are legitimate roles, right? So, scientists can play these roles, but it's not always recognized by scientists, not even by our university. They tend to hide a little bit behind neutrality, but this is what scientists do. And then you have this more action research role, which is here called kind of the participatory knowledge co-creator, which is actually working with society and chooses whom to work with, right? So they're also from a particular value commitment trying to generate useful knowledge together with stakeholders. these are legitimate roles for scientists to play, and not. I think that's what society also expects from us.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Case. Yeah, I mean, that could open so many other discussions, like when science is politicized. But this is really helpful. Thank you so much. I want to turn us now to the discussion portion of our class so that we can start to work on the questions that you've given us. I think it would be nice to give groups about at least 10 minutes to discuss the questions you posed. Nina, I didn't see your questions at the end. Would you like us to start with Case's questions? We have about 20 minutes left, and I'd like to break people out into groups. And those of you who are just joining for the webinar can jump off. I want to preserve about 10 minutes at the end of class to go over our syllabus with the students.
Well, I was curious to hear how the students relate my story to the story of Gender Up. That was one of the things that I thought was interesting to reflect on. Is it very different? Is it very similar? Are the implications similar, or are there huge differences between my story and the story that you heard about Gender Up?
Yeah, so we can definitely tackle that question. One thing to note is that we presented Gender Up in about 30 and like maybe 15 minutes as a part of a larger class. So they should be familiar with Gender Up and the tool of Gender Up. If people could just give a thumbs up if you would feel comfortable talking on that subject, given your knowledge on Gender Up.
We can maybe split, so I mean, we can split up in groups, and the groups decide what they talk about or not. Because my question was, and we partly covered that, was about, what problems do we, what system failures or negative outcomes do we see in the international development? And what kind of institutional innovations would be needed? We already discussed, one of the institutional innovations is changing the indicators and the time horizons, right? So we could, but there's other things that probably need to change, and that's maybe we can think about who should be putting pressure on the system.
Okay.
But I think the groups can maybe decide what they want to talk about.
Yeah, let's do that. So the two questions are on the table are, how does Nina's case study relate to the story, or Nina's story and research relate to the tool of Gender Up? Can you see any connections, or are there no connections? Would Gender Up have, or some sort of gender analysis or social differentiation analysis helped that story be different is another way to think of it.
Yeah.
And then Case's question on what are the systems failure within international development, what's being left out of the discussion, how could we maybe overcome some of these systems failures? Is that a good representation of your question, Case? Great, so those are the two questions that you can choose to answer within your groups, and we're going to break you out of your group for about 10 minutes now. And Kristen will do the breaking out.
What happens to us, Erin? We're also breaking out, right?
I think we'll stay in our own group and let the participants discuss amongst themselves. Yeah. And then we'll hear the share out afterward. I just want to make sure. Kristen, you're breaking people out, right?
Yeah, I want to.
Okay, thank you so much. And while Kristen's breaking us out, just because this is very relevant to this group of people, I shared a postdoc opportunity on all the topics we're covering in the chat. Heather shared it. So if you all are finishing your PhD soon or know someone, the links there.
Yes. Something is happening.
People are moving to their groups.
Group 2 seems to have a problem. There's only one person there.
Yeah, Krishna. Oh, there you go.
Oh, no, that's now 2.
Janelle, are you there? Did you need to be moved to a group?
Hi, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm on a train and my signal keeps going in and out. I think it looks like it was trying to put me into a group and then I think I lost the signal.
Okay, no problem. Let me assign you now. Good luck. And Clarice, I don't know if you're here, actually here. Yeah, I think he just, or they might be left over from the webinar, and which I'm sure has happened to me before, is left on the screen.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Those were great presentations.
Yeah, it was fun. You're muted, Nina.
I liked it. It was a while ago that I talked about it, so I liked to go back to it.
Yeah.
I can see why we cited your work in Gender Up now that I have even more fuller representation of it. It definitely, like all of your findings, I think we took up and used in Gender Up.
It's quite funny because actually in my work I did a lot of action research, but also advisory on gender in agricultural projects. But my PhD I did not